just 20 years old, director, writer Rolf Kainski made There's Nothing Out There, a 1991 meta horror comedy. I believe he actually started making this movie script-wise when he was just 18. So, There's Nothing Out There. Now this movie is somewhat kind of a little bit of a cult favourite these days, but it didn't get its just desserts when it came out, because it kind of really was one of the early movies to have this kind of meta style, winking at the audience kind of style of horror comedy that we later saw in Scream, and then later still in like Cabin in the Woods. Now what's the story? It focuses on a group of friends as they are going away for kind of a weekend away in the woods somewhere, not really in a cabin. It's actually quite a nice modern house, but there you go. It's by a kind of a small kind of lake and woodland and everything. And one of these friends is this kind of horror movie aficionado who kind of uses his knowledge and about how to kind of maybe survive this weekend once they are attacked by this strange creature, which appears to be a kind of a mix between a giant mutant frog and an octopus. And he kind of uses his skills as a kind of horror movie fan to look for the kind of the tell signs, predict what will happen, and kind of find a way to maybe defeat this monster if they can. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this gets credit where credit is due. Okay, Scream gets a lot of kind of plaudits for being the movie that kind of really looked at the kind of the horror genre and used that as a kind of a meta platform, and it got a lot of attention for that. But obviously this was a good few years before Scream, and to be fair, was largely ignored. I think even until quite recently, where it's kind of had a little bit of a second wind when it's kind of come out on Blu-ray and things. But yes, it's a very meta film, and there are some kind of quite fun nods and things, and kind of like tropes that we've all kind of we all know as horror fans, and some more overt comedy. There's quite a funny scene, for example, where a character is trying to dodge this monster, and he kind of grabs the boom mic, which is obviously above his head, and kind of uses that to kind of swing out the way of the monster and things like this. So there's some quite kind of fun meta moments in this film. So it's definitely a tongue-in-cheek film, although the actual plot is, it's very similar to more kind of straight kind of horror films, if that makes sense. It just has these little horror twinges, and our characters they're not overly kind of spoofy, so you can still kind of watch this as a somewhat kind of straight horror film, but it just has these extra little tweaks about this kind of like what will happen in the horror movie and things like this. The movie's got a lot of nudity in it, and as far as I know, it was independently produced. The director's parents remortgaged their house to actually pay for the film. So, again, this is a real kind of passion project, and you can see the reverence for the kind of like the horror movie genre, from this kind of writer-director, as he kind of recreates, obviously, things he's clearly kind of watched. There's a great intro sequence where we have effectively a sequence in a video shop where someone's getting attacked in a video shop. Again, it's that reverence for the kind of the horror scene in the kind of like the 1980s and things like that. So it's a lot of fun, I think, this is a film for horror movie fans. It is low budget, it is a little cheesy, and ultimately, we'll come on to more about why I think it doesn't work in just a minute, but it is kind of still, I think, a passion project, and I think horror movie fans, certainly of the kind of the 80s, would appreciate the clear kind of love for the kind of genre that has gone into this movie. The characters are cliche, but they're still kind of quite likeable. I have to say, I did quite like their relationship. The guy who's this kind of horror movie fan, he really tends to be the kind of like the lead. Although you don't necessarily would think that first of all, but I quite like the relationship with, for example, with him and his kind of like his best friend, whose parents own the house. Except they seem like genuinely kind of good friends. And there was a kind of some quite good kind of like sequences of dialogue really, where the guy who owns the house, he's saying to his horror movie friend, like, just calm down and things like this. It does seem like a joke within a joke, and it's like, but it still has this kind of realistic kind of dialogue and kind of natural sounding dialogue that you can imagine if someone were to be spat like that, how you would kind of respond to it, not completely dismissing it, but also just telling them to kind of calm down and things. So I quite like some of the characters, their interactions and things like this. The monsters are a little cheesy and a little crappy, but it's kind of fun. Practical effects, it's quite a kind of original looking to a certain degree. It's certainly very alien looking, and it has this extra element where it can kind of hypnotise people. So it does have an extra layer of threat. Once it gets going, it's pretty much kind of like quite fast paced, and and it's quite a lot of fun. So again, it's somewhat typical, even though it's referencing and poking fun at the horror movie genre of the 80s. It still very much feels like a movie, just like the ones it's poking fun at. So you can watch this either with a kind of the comedy in mind and kind of enjoy the meta stuff, or I think it's enjoyable still. It's just a kind of a straight 80s creature feature. What doesn't work, I don't think it's as clever, maybe, as later iterations of kind of meta horror films. I mean, it is just one guy who constantly kind of goes on about it, and outside of a couple of moments, I don't think it maybe goes far enough to some degree, but at the same time, the guy who is constantly talking about horror films, that seems to be his only thing. I mean, he doesn't talk about anything else. There's no other kind of type of conversation that character has in the movie. So it seems like he's not particularly like a character which has any other facets to his personality. It's just that. And I think it would have been maybe a little better if he still was a big horror movie fan, but maybe he had some other conversations, some other kind of like interests or personality traits that sort of come through. One of the cliches, I think, with movies in the 80s is they do just tend to have very much like singular characters where there's just one personality trait, and there's nothing else. And this movie does somewhat fall into that, even though it is making commentary about it. So there is that. The creature itself, I think, is a little small to be this threatening. When you kind of see it attack, you're thinking this is no bigger than a dog, and it shouldn't be that hard to deal with, really, considering you've got quite a big group of kind of characters there, and there's some kind of the hypnosis angle. Again, I don't want to kind of go too much into the kind of like the spoiler of elements to it, but there's some things there that I think could have been done a little differently. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, despite this movie being like I say, a meta film, it kind of plays very much like your standard creature feature of the 80s. So again, maybe it could have had ways to be, a little bit more inventive to a certain degree. But you've got to give credit where credit is due. It is kind of certainly a movie that has some cleverness to it, some originality, considering, again, this came out a good few years before the likes of Scream. And it's still a fun movie to a certain degree, if a little bit kind of silly and flawed on its own right. So I'll give this one an above score of a 6 out of 10. It's certainly not a classic, but I think it's a watchable film if you enjoy 80s creature features with some kind of likeable characters and some good gags in there. 6 out of 10, have you seen it? Please do let me know what your thoughts are if you have, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.